Magandang-Ara, Pilipinas. Can you imagine this?
Yeah.
You own this piece of land.
Hmm.
You know, this is like your ancestral land. You're dreaming of passing it on to your children.
Right.
And then suddenly you discover
Oh,
this massive power line just cutting right through it.
wow.
And it's been there for decades.
Like you had no idea.
You had absolutely no idea.
Yeah,
No permission was asked.
that's a problem.
So can the government just do that?
All right.
Can they just plant their flag on your private property
Right.
and say, hey, it's for the public good?
For the greater good.
For the greater good, tough luck.
Yeah.
What happens to the landowner's rights in that situation?
Yeah.
Does time just erase
Right.
all the legal wrongs?
Especially when it's something so fundamental as land.
Especially when it comes to the ground beneath our feet.
Yeah.
So this is a fascinating case.
Very interesting.
It really went through the Philippine Supreme Court
It did.
and wrestled with these very questions.
Absolutely.
So welcome to the deep dive.
Welcome.
Where we're going to be tackling a very interesting topic
Mm-hmm.
that I think is so relevant to
I think a lot of people can relate to this in some way.
a lot of people in the Philippines.
For sure.
And it's really this question of
Yeah.
property rights versus
Versus the need.
infrastructure development
Yeah.
and kind of finding that balance
Yeah. Finding the balance.
when they clash.
Exactly.
So specifically today, we are zeroing in on the Supreme Court case
Right.
between the National Power Corporation,
You know.
or NPC,
Yeah.
versus the spouses Rufo and Tomasa Llorin.
Okay.
And this case revolves around
All right.
NPC's decades-long occupation
Okay.
of a portion of the Llorin's private property
All right.
located in Naga City.
Okay.
And this land was being used
Right.
for power transmission lines.
Yeah. Which are obviously
You know, critical infrastructure
for everyone.
that we all rely on.
Exactly.
Now, if you want to really get into the nitty-gritty
Get into the details.
of this case, our primary source today
Okay.
is the Supreme Court's decision
Right.
in GR No, 195217,
All right.
dated January 13th, 2021.
So this is where they had the final say.
This is where the final word was delivered.
Yeah.
So our mission today
Our goal.
for you, dear listener, is to really unpack the legal intricacies
All the twists and
for
turns.
this situation.
Yeah.
We want to understand the different perspectives at play
Understand every angle.
and ultimately grasp how the Supreme Court resolved this very long-standing issue.
Exactly.
Our aim here is to provide you with a clearer understanding
Yeah.
of your rights as a property owner here in the Philippines
Yeah.
and how eminent domain actually works
Mhm.
in practice.
Yeah, because, it's one thing to read it
Right.
in a textbook or in a law,
Yeah.
but to see how it plays out in real life
Yeah.
with real people
In a real case.
and real consequences.
Right.
That's where the rubber meets the road.
Absolutely. So let's set the stage. With the facts of the case as they unfolded,
Yeah.
so the spouses Llorin were the registered owners
Oh,
of a pretty substantial piece of property
Right.
in Naga City.
Okay.
We're talking over 100,000 square meters,
Wow, that's a lot.
all under transfer certificate of Title No 29725.
Okay, they had the paperwork.
They had all the paperwork.
Right.
Now, way back in 1978,
Okay, so a while ago,
the National Power Corporation
NPC.
entered and occupied a portion of this land,
Okay.
about 10,500 square meters.
Still a significant chunk.
Still a big chunk.
Yeah.
And they did so without getting the explicit consent
Also just moved in.
of the Llorin's predecessors in interest.
So the previous owners.
The previous owners,
That's-
the folks who owned it at that time. So
No.
they didn't just take an empty field.
Right.
They actually built stuff
Okay.
on that 10,500 square meter area.
Right.
The NPC went ahead and constructed
Built it up.
and installed. There are 69 kV Nagatinambak power transmission lines.
So this is the critical infrastructure
This was a big deal.
that was serving
Yeah.
probably a lot of people.
Yeah, bringing electricity to the region.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, what's interesting here
All
is,
right.
according to the records,
Mm-hmm.
while the original landowners didn't give formal consent,
Right.
they basically tolerated the NPC's presence.
They let it slide.
Yeah, they let it slide.
Interesting.
And this tolerance was based on assurances from the NPC
So they made promises.
that the structures were temporary,
Oh, yeah.
that if the owners ever needed the property back, they'd vacate.
They would leave.
And most importantly, that they'd pay monthly rentals.
Okay, so there was some sort of agreement,
Yeah, it was a handshake deal.
a verbal
A
agreement.
verbal agreement.
Yeah.
So you can see how,
Yeah.
the landowners might have felt
Like they had an understanding.
Like they were protected,
Right.
but it wasn't legally binding
Ultimately, no.
in the long run.
Right.
So this really highlights the importance of formalizing these agreements,
Yeah.
especially when you're dealing with like government, big corporations.
Large entities.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So as time went on,
Right.
these promises weren't kept.
Oh, so they weren't paying rent.
No, they were not paying rent.
And they weren't moving.
And despite repeated demands from the Llorin family who inherited the property, they wanted them to return the land and pay the rent.
Makes sense.
But the National Power Corporation didn't either.
So you just stayed put.
Stayed put.
Wow.
And this went on for almost 3 decades.
3 decades.
Yeah.
That's a long time.
So fast forward to 2006.
Okay.
The Llorin spouses, they've had enough.
Yeah.
These informal negotiations have gone nowhere.
Right.
So they decide to take legal action, and they file a complaint for unlawful detainer against NPC
Right.
in the municipal trial court in cities of Naga City.
Okay.
And this became civil case number 127-12-6.
All right. So that's the case number for anyone who wants to look it up.
For the legal nerds out there.
Right.
Now, when we say unlawful detainer,
Yes. What does that mean?
this is a legal action
Oh.
where you want to recover possession of a property from someone who's refusing to leave.
After their right to be there is over.
After the right to be there has ended.
Yeah.
So, of course, the NPC,
Right.
they had their legal defense.
They weren't just going to roll over.
They weren't just going to say, okay, you got us.
Right.
They argued that the case should be dismissed on a couple of grounds.
What were they?
First, they said, look, we're not even the right people to sue anymore.
Okay.
Because all those power transmission assets, those had already been transferred.
Transferred to who?
To the National Transmission Corporation.
Okay.
Or Transco.
Right.
And this happened under Republic Act 9136.
Oh.
Now, Republic Act 9136, also known as the Electric Power Industry Reform Act of 2001.
Catchy title.
Yeah, okay.
Was a huge law.
Landmark law.
That restructured the Philippine power sector.
Okay, big shift.
And a key part of this was privatizing.
Okay.
And transferring a lot of NPC's assets and functions.
So NPC was getting out of the transmission business?
To Transco.
To Transco. So they're saying, hey, go see Transco.
Right. We're not the ones in charge anymore.
We're done.
Yeah.
We're out of here.
Okay.
Now, the second thing that NPC argued was that even if they were the proper party, this legal action was barred by prescription and latches.
Ah, 2 big legal concepts.
2 legal hurdles.
So,
So prescription, in this legal context, it basically refers to, like, you missed the deadline.
The time limit.
Yeah, you waited too long to file this case.
You snooze, you lose kind of thing.
Kinda, yeah. There's a statutory period to assert your rights.
Right.
And if you miss that window,
you're out of luck.
Tough luck.
Yeah.
Now latches is a little bit different. Latches is about an unreasonable delay.
Like you're dragging your feet.
Yeah, you're dragging your feet in asserting your right.
Right.
And that delay can prejudice the other party.
It makes it harder for them to defend themselves.
Yeah.
Because maybe evidence is gone.
Yeah, memories fade.
Memories fade, people move.
Witnesses disappear.
Witnesses disappear, exactly.
Really?
So it becomes unfair.
Unfair to unravel.
To try to go back and figure out what happened.
After so long.
Yeah.
So NPC was basically saying, hey, you waited too long.
Too long, guys, too long.
To file this case.
Yeah.
So the case goes to the municipal trial court in cities.
Okay.
And in their decision, dated June 19th, 2007,
right,
the MTCC ruled,
drum roll please,
in favor of the spouses Llorin.
Oh, wow.
So the court ordered the NPC to vacate the property, pay monthly rentals of PHP 5,000 from September 2006 until they vacated, and pay PHP 20,000 in attorney's fees, plus the cost of the lawsuit.
So a clear win.
Clear win for the Llorins.
So the Llorins.
At this level. So it seemed like they were going to get their land back and get some compensation.
And get compensated.
For the use of the land.
Yeah.
But of course. This is just the beginning.
It's a long road.
Of the legal battle.
Yeah.
NPC was not going down without a fight.
Right. They appealed.
They appealed the MTCC's decision to the regional trial court.
Okay. One step up.
One step up.
On the ladder.
Now, in a decision dated December 7, 2007.
Okay, so pretty quick turnaround.
Yeah. The RTC affirmed the MTCC's ruling.
So they agreed with the lower court.
They said, yeah.
You're right.
Right.
The MPC needs to vacate.
NPC needs to vacate.
And pay up.
They need to pay up.
Yeah.
So again.
Second win for the Llorins?
Second win for the Llorins.
Okay.
But still.
Still not over.
Not over.
Yeah.
NPC is persistent.
They're not giving up.
They're not giving up.
Oh, yeah.
They elevate the case to the Court of Appeals.
Okay. All the way to the Court of Appeals.
Oh, right. And in a decision dated June 27, 2008, the Court of Appeals also dismissed NPC's petition for review.
So they upheld the lower courts.
They said, look,
yeah,
we agree with the lower courts.
You're good.
The Llorin's complaint is sufficient for unlawful detainer.
Mm-hmm.
They haven't lost their right
to the property.
Due to latches or prescription.
Right.
And they even addressed this whole Transco issue.
Right, because NPC had said,
right,
don't sue us, sue Transco.
Yeah, we're not the right people.
We're not involved.
But the Court of Appeals pointed out.
What'd they say?
That both parties had agreed.
Oh, so they had acknowledged.
That NPC actually still owned the lines.
Even though Transco was the operator.
That Transco was the operator, but NPC was still the owner.
Got it.
And the Court of Appeals even denied
wow.
NPC's motion for reconsideration.
So they tried again.
In January 2011.
And still no news.
Still no dice.
So at this point.
So after going through three levels.
3 levels of the court.
Of the Philippine judicial system.
Yeah.
The Llorins were winning.
They were on a roll.
It seemed like they were going to get their land back.
Right.
And they were going to get this compensation.
Yeah, all signs pointed to victory.
But this is where the Supreme Court steps in.
Dun, dun, dun.
Right.
The highest court in the land.
And their rulings can overturn
they can.
Previous decisions.
They're the final word.
So in this case, the question before them.
Yeah, the big question.
Was whether this unlawful detainer action was actually the right way.
The right way.
To get NPC.
Or Transco.
Off this property that had been occupied for public use.
For these power lines.
Since 1978.
Since 1978.
So that was the crux of the issue.
Yeah, that reached the highest court.
That the Supreme Court had to decide.
Right.
And this is where things take a huge turn.
Okay.
In a decision that reversed all the lower courts.
Wow.
The Supreme Court ruled.
In favor of
NPCs.
NPCs.
So big reversal.
Big reversal.
And their decision was based on a few legal principles.
All right, let's break it down.
First, they emphasized Republic Act number 9136.
The one we talked about before?
The Electric Power Industry Reform Act.
The big one.
And they highlighted that this law not only transferred the electrical transmission functions to Transco, but it also transferred the power of eminent domain.
That's important.
Which is a pretty big deal.
Yeah, explain that.
So eminent domain, it's basically the government's right.
The state's right.
To take private property for public use.
Mm-hmm.
But the key is they have to pay.
They have to pay.
Just compensation.
It's just compensation.
So it's not just a free-for-all.
Oh, can't just take it.
They can't just come in and say, too bad, we need this land.
Right.
So in this case, Transco inherited that power of eminent domain from NPC.
Okay, so they now have the power.
They have the power.
To take the land.
But they have to pay for it.
But they have to pay for it.
Okay. Now, the Supreme Court also said, look, this property has been used for a public purpose.
There are those power lines.
With power lines since 1978.
1978.
It's been continuously used to serve the Naga-Tinambak area.
Yeah.
So they really put a lot of weight on that public use aspect.
That's public use.
And then they cited
case.
This really important case.
Oh.
National Transmission Corps v. Bermuda Development Corps.
Okay.
GR, no, 214782. Dated April 3, 2019.
Okay, so a fairly recent case.
Yeah. And in this case, the Supreme Court had already said...
What did they say?
That unlawful detainer isn't the right way.
Not the right tool.
To get a public utility company off of property.
If it's being used for public use.
If it's being used for public service.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because the thinking is, if you just kick them off through a simple ejectment order.
You disrupt those services.
You're going to disrupt these essential services.
Yeah, that hurts everyone.
That hurts the whole community.
Yeah.
So they're saying there's got to be a better way.
Right. A more balanced approach.
To
handle these situations.
So in the Llorin case.
The
Supreme Court basically applied the principles from the Bermuda case.
Okay, so they followed that precedent.
Yeah. And they said, look, when a landowner is trying to get a public utility off their property, the court has options.
Okay.
They can dismiss the case without prejudice.
Without prejudice. So what does that mean?
Without prejudice means the landowner can still file other legal actions, like a claim for just compensation or damages.
Okay, so they're not completely out of line.
Well, completely out of luck.
They just can't use this particular route.
Legal route.
The second option is they can dismiss the case, but tell the public utility company to start expropriation proceedings.
So to formally acquire the land.
Yeah. Go through the formal legal process.
And pay the owner. Just compensation.
Just compensation.
Okay.
And then they mentioned this third option, which is less common.
Yeah.
But the court could actually turn the case into an expropriation proceeding itself.
Oh, so they could just handle it right there?
But only if they have the right jurisdiction.
And power?
Yeah, the power to determine the value of the land.
Okay, so that's a little trickier.
A little trickier.
Yeah.
Now, the Supreme Court said...
What'd they say?
Look, the MPCC in the Llorin case...
Yeah.
They should have done one of these things.
What are these options?
They should either dismiss the case...
Yeah.
And let the Llorins file a claim...
Yeah.
Or told NPC...
Right.
To start expropriation.
To do it the right way.
Do it the right way.
Yeah.
But they didn't.
They didn't.
And the Supreme Court also pointed out...
What'd they say?
That the Llorins...
Yeah.
And their predecessors...
Yeah.
They had tolerated this occupation.
For decades.
For decades.
That's a long time.
Without formally demanding...
Expropriation.
Expropriation.
So the Supreme Court's thinking was...
Yeah, what was their logic?
They basically waived their right...
To get the land back.
Yeah.
By not taking action sooner.
Because they were silent for so long. They were like, okay...
let this be.
We'll let this slide.
Yeah.
So now they're saying... You can't just suddenly demand the property back, especially when it's being used.
For this essential public service.
For this critical public infrastructure.
Exactly.
So this from court basically said, any legal action trying to force a public utility...
Like
Transco to get off the property... is probably not going to succeed.
Probably not going to fly.
Not going to fly. Because of public policy.
Right.
Public necessity.
We need that electricity.
We need that electricity.
Yeah.
And this concept called equitable estoppel.
Equitable estoppel. Okay, explain that one.
So equitable estoppel is basically, you can't just change your mind after being silent for so long.
Yeah.
Especially when your silence led the other party
to rely on your inaction.
To act in a certain way.
Yeah.
And it would now be unfair
to
let you change your mind.
To let you go back on your word.
Right.
Yeah.
So in their final ruling, the Supreme Court reversed all the lower courts.
Wow.
And dismissed the unlawful detainer complaint.
Okay, there's a but.
This is important.
Yeah.
The dismissal was without prejudice.
Oh, good. We talked about that.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So that means the Llorins, they can still file a separate legal action for just compensation.
For the value of their land.
Yeah, and for any damages
that they suffered.
They may have incurred.
Yeah.
So it's not a complete loss.
Not a complete loss.
But it is a significant shift.
A shift in their legal strategy.
Yeah. So this case really makes you think.
It does.
What does this mean for property owners in the Philippines?
Yeah, like how do we balance
these private property rights
with
the need
for infrastructure.
For these big infrastructure projects. Yeah. And how can landowners protect themselves?
Yeah, what can they do proactively?
If the government comes knocking and says, hey, we need your land for a power line.
Or a road or a bridge.
Or a highway.
Right.
What can they do?
Tough questions.
These are tough questions.
Yeah.
And we'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, what do you think?
What do you think about this case?
Leave a comment.
Leave a comment down below.
Yeah, that's what you think.
And give us a thumbs up.
A like.
If you found this deep dive insightful.
Yeah. If you learned something.
Yeah, let's recap.
Let's recap some of the key legal doctrines. Yeah. The big ideas.
From this case.
Yeah, because there were a lot of them.
There were a lot.
Rolling around.
So first we have eminent domain.
Right.
Again, this is the government's right.
The state's right.
To take private property for public use.
But they got to pay.
They have to pay just compensation.
Just compensation.
They can't just take it.
It's not free.
And in this case, Transco inherited that power from MPC so they can take the land.
But they have to pay the Llorins.
But they have to pay.
Yeah.
Next up, we have unlawful detainer.
Right.
This is that specific legal action to get someone off your property.
When they don't have the right to be there anymore.
When they're there illegally.
Yeah.
But the Supreme Court said this wasn't the right tool.
Not the right tool.
In this case, because again, we're talking about public use.
Public use.
They're talking about essential service.
Essential services.
You don't want to disrupt that.
Not lightly.
Not lightly.
Yeah.
Then there's just compensation for your right.
And this is more than just the fair market value of the land.
It includes more.
It includes any consequential damages.
Yeah, like if you had to move.
If you had to relocate.
And find a new place to live.
Or lost income.
Or lost business opportunities.
Lost business opportunities.
Yeah.
Anything that stemmed from having to give up your land.
Right.
And that's what the LlorinG
That's their primary remedy now.
Can still pursue.
Yeah.
We also talked about latches.
Right. The delay.
That unreasonable delay.
And asserting your rights.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And while the lower courts didn't think it was a problem,
right,
the Supreme Court did consider.
They took it into account.
The decades of inaction by the LlorinG.
And said that's why they can't get the land back.
And they said, look,
yeah,
you can't get the land back.
But you can still get compensated.
You can still get the money.
Yeah.
And then finally, we have public policy.
Right.
And public necessity.
The big picture.
The big picture.
Yeah. And these are these huge considerations that sometimes dictate
the outcome.
Legal outcomes.
Yeah.
And in this case, keeping the power lines running is a huge public policy issue.
It's essential.
It's a public necessity.
Yeah. We need that electricity.
And the Supreme Court didn't want to disrupt that.
They did not.
So all these legal doctrines working together.
It's a puzzle.
They form this framework for the Supreme Court's decision.
Right.
And it really shows